Please be seated. Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, as you can see, things are different today. Welcome, Father Paul. Before the service, I noticed folks greeting him. And in particular, I noticed one lady in the parish who walked up to him and threw her arms around him. And with tears glistening in her eyes, she said, "At last, at last." I want you to know I feel exactly the same way about Ponthiola, okay? So, and while we did have a round of applause for Paul, here's the rock star, folks. We are greatly blessed, and I'm excited about what the future holds for St. Matthew's and our mutual ministry in this place. And thinking about our church, our parish, and what it is like and what it's about, and pondering that this week, I was sort of called back to different moments in my now 16 years as your priest. And one that stood out in a particularly powerful way, and it's related to our gospel readings, was what y'all did in the fall of 2010. So almost 10 years ago, I turned 50, which means right now, 10 years ago, I was 49. But in the fall of 2010, I was turning 50, and y'all threw a wonderful party in the gym, and it was just great. I am not sure why Lori Winkles hit me in the face with a pie at that party, but y'all all seemed to enjoy it. And the great thing was that the celebration didn't end then, because what this wonderful place did, y'all sent me on a vacation to Colorado to spend my 50th birthday with my brother Charlie, who was turning 60 at the same time. And I have photographs of us together with friends out there with cake on our 50th and 60th birthday. It was wonderful. I left here, I drove west. I took 40 all the way across Texas, got over into New Mexico, turned north into Colorado, and got to Canyon City, Colorado, where my brother Charlie had recently retired back to about 2 years before. It's a place that he'd lived for many, many years, and he wanted to be back there. He'd been living in California, but he wanted to be back in Canyon City because one of his great passions was fly fishing. He loved to fly fish. And he had a little home on the bluff overlooking the Arkansas River, which flowed through Canyon City, which meant that on any day when the weather would allow, he could be fishing. I got there in the afternoon. We went for a long walk together. And the next morning he said, "We're going someplace special." Now, I had assumed that we would just be fishing right there, but he said, no, I want you to see something. And so we got out in the truck and we drove up Highway 50 toward the Royal Gorge, and eventually you go through Bighorn Canyon, which they call that because of the bighorn sheep that come down. It's a little 2-lane winding highway, and bighorn sheep come down and they drink from the river right there, and they're kind of stacked up on the mountainside coming down to the water. It's beautiful. It's part of a long twisting road that leads you through a spur of the Sangre de Cristos. That means the blood of Christ. It's a mountain range. It's a part of the Rockies. It's just exquisite. But we turned onto Highway 50, going toward the Royal Gorge, went through the gorge, and then we turned due north, onto Colorado Highway number 9. Then eventually we turned off onto something called 39 Mile Road. And I saw a sign off to our right that said 11-mile reservoir. I said, Charlie, where are we going? He said, I'm taking you to the Dream Stream. I said, the Dream Stream? I said, well, how far is it? He says, you see that reservoir right there? I said, yeah. He said, what's the name of it? I said, 11-mile reservoir. That's what the sign said. He said, we got about 11 more miles to go. After about 11 miles, the road bends, and there's a small bridge over the South Platte, which flows into the reservoir. And there's a dirt and gravel parking lot right there, and we pulled into it. Now, we hadn't seen another car, another truck for the last 30 minutes. It was just us. We got out of the truck, and we pulled on our waders, and we got our gear, our rods, and we started walking through this tall grass in this extraordinary alpine valley. Tall grass, and off to our right is the South Platte. It's 15 to 20 yards wide right there, and it's a beautiful, beautiful, pristine trout stream with water rushing over rock. It's absolutely gorgeous. And as we walked, I looked around, and we're in a valley that is ringed by 10 and 12 and even a few 14,000-foot mountains. All of them in October of that year capped with snow, and all of them with golden leaves on their sides from the aspens that were turning yellow. It was beautiful. There was a light breeze. It was cool. And we walked through that grass, and I'm following my brother, and I'm watching him. You see, he and I were profoundly close. And I always assumed that I knew him just about as well as I knew myself. But there was something about that place and that moment that made him different. We got to this long, wide sweep of the South Platte. And he stepped down to the water and he started stripping line. And he stepped into the water and he began casting. Now, if you know anything about fly fishing, you'll know that the motion of the cast is very much like that of a metronome, that pendulum that musicians can use for tempo and beat. And it goes back and forward and back and forward. And on the back cast, you're pulling out line. And on the forward cast, you're throwing it out in front of you. And I noticed that there was this profound precision to what he was doing and an intensity in his motions and movements that I had never seen before. But it wasn't mechanistic. There was this extraordinary grace and beauty as the line would sweep back and arc back and go forward like a wave until he would lay it out across the water. And it would drift for a moment, and in its drifting, he would move. He'd take a step forward and back and perhaps side to side. And I realized it was a dance in the water that I was watching. And then he'd pick it up off the water and he'd lay it out again. And I knew something that I'd never known before, that in that moment, I was seeing my brother for the first time in the fullness of who he truly was. He was authentically himself, lost in that moment. It was not transfiguring or transformative. It was transportive. It took him into a place and a presence that only he could feel and see. All I could do was watch and see my brother for the first time in the fullness of who he was. Our reading today in the gospel is from Matthew. Now, theologians will tell you that each of the different gospels, the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then the fourth gospel, John, each have a particular perspective. And each of those perspectives, if we look closely, we can see something a little bit different being revealed about Christ in each of them. In the gospel according to Matthew, We are experiencing Jesus with Hebrew eyes. You see, Matthew is considered to be the most Hebrew, the most Jewish of all the Gospels. It pays particular attention to an understanding of the law and the place of the synagogue and the role of the rabbi, and most importantly, of the absolute fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy in the life and work and presence of Jesus in the world. And so because of that fulfillment, we get to glance back for a moment at Genesis. Genesis tells the story of temptation, of a choice made by humanity, not by just Eve, but rather Adam and Eve. And you can think of this literally, you can think of it metaphorically. But the fact is, when presented with the opportunity to be fully who they were or to long to be like God, they succumb to the temptation to choose to try to be like God, to not be who God truly made them to be. A dear friend of mine, I had lunch with him last week. He and his wife had just gotten back from 2 weeks in the Holy Land. And we sat at lunch and he showed me pictures of things. And he says, I just couldn't believe how small it was. So what do you mean small? He said, well, you know, I guess I have these images from movies and television shows of these great sweeping vistas and these extraordinary structures. And yet the reality was everything was taking place within a small area. And he's right. When we hear about John baptizing in the wilderness is right outside the city. It's not some 1,000-mile away place that you go and you are hundreds of miles away from civilization. No, if you remember, people were coming out from the cities to him because he was accessible. So when we hear about wilderness in this context, it's just a place where you can go to be away from the distractions of daily life, to be away from the noise, to be away from all of those things that pull you away from your awareness of God. Not just awareness of God in the world, but specifically those things that pull you away from your awareness of God in your life. We are in the midst of Lent, a time in which we are supposed to experience the reality of who God has truly made us to be. We have 40 days of penance, preparation, 40 days truly of longing for the fulfillment of God's plan in our lives and in the world. 40 days. I was reading a commentator, Tom Wright, who said that in this moment, when Jesus is tempted at the end of those 40 days by the deceiver, the tempter, that the fact that he does not succumb to that temptation does not mean that he is fully divine, that he is fully the Son of God. Rather, it means that he is making the choice that had been offered to humanity from the very beginning, which was to be fully human, fully as God made us to be, in right relationship with him. This is not about divinity. And Lent for you and I is not our striving to be some small version of God. Rather, it's an opportunity for us to claim the fullness of our humanity and be who God intended us to be from the very start. Two years after that fishing expedition with my brother Charlie, I was back in that same place with my older brother, Ashmore. So Ash and I have taken Charlie because he wanted to go to that spot. He wanted my oldest brother to see it as I had. The difference is that this time my brother had been ravaged by cancer. He was probably 30 or 40 pounds lighter. He was very, very pale, and he was very, very weak. We got to that dirt and gravel parking lot, and we got out, and Charlie took my dad's old cane. I don't even know where he had gotten it. He took my dad's old cane, and he used that, and he walked out with Ash and I on either side of him, and he walked out into that tall grass, and he walked, and as he walked, he stood taller and taller and straighter until we got to a point where you could see that long sweep of the river where we had fished. And he stood there, and with a clear voice, he told me and he told Ash, he said, "That's where you put me. You put my ashes there, and I'll ride down the river and into the reservoir, and maybe one day all the way to the ocean. And it'll be you and me and the sky and God and big trout." In that moment, once again, he was fully who God had made him to be. And that's the opportunity we have as well. To spend these 40 days discerning in our hearts who we are authentically. Who is the person that Christ made you to be? Amen.